Just briefly, I was born in Northern Ireland, grew up mostly in England, studied Irish history in Scotland, worked mostly in England as a teacher and then a museum educator, and just recently have, in the last 5 years, gone to Wales as director of the National Museum. So I've lived in all 4 countries of the United Kingdom. In looking back on my professional life, I can see that, I mean, I've never been a theorist, really. I've always started from a concern about my own practice, actually, really, and our sector practice, and trying to look for solutions which I could apply back into my work. And I had a kind of crisis of faith in museum education, museum learning, in the 1990s, and the report which the UK government published in 1997, which was about museums and learning, privately for me was really my struggling with myself to justify working in museums if one was an educator. So it was an exercise in criticizing and then trying to rethink for myself why it's a valid thing to do when museums so often are so appallingly poor as learning institutions. And then in the early 2000s, when I could see that however valid the arguments and however strong the research for learning in museums was, in the United Kingdom, the practice of most museums was still appalling. And that the problem here was not just one of rational argument, it's actually one of philosophical opposition to learning in many museums, if it meant changing anything significantly, which it should. So I then looked for a different rationale and looked at human rights instead as being a foundation. And the United Kingdom had signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and had committed itself to implement its requirements, which included, as we heard today, from Jose Non, the requirement that everybody should be able to participate in the cultural life of the community. And I was inspired by the work of Henry Shue, an American theorist of human rights, who explored the practical implications of these commitments. So I wrote a very sort of sketchy piece of work called New Lamps for Old, where I explored the issues of applying human rights to museum cultural practice. Then in my own institution at the time, the Victoria and Albert Museum, we had the opportunity from private funding to create a new education centre. And for me, this was an opportunity to, for the first time, to create a space within a museum that I hoped would be driven by some of the principles which I and my colleagues had been exploring. And this turned into the Sackler Centre for Arts Education at the V&A. And I would say that not only was it an attempt to create spaces that respected the public as learners, it was also quite consciously and quite deliberately a critique of the V&A itself. In other words, to create within the V&A its own critique. To start off with the discipline of art and design and the ambition that it should be publicly accessible, and then to do it differently from the principles which very often the organization applied in its own work. And I do think there is an important role for practitioners if one is to a degree silenced in how one can talk about our work, we can still critique, debate, and change through action, which itself then can take the place of words. And for me, the Sackler Centre was that. The V&A at that time was becoming an increasingly conservative organization, increasingly hostile, in my view, to its origins as a learning organisation right back in the 19th century. So for me, it was really important that we should try to transform physical space into something that was based on a different set of values from those which were dominant in the second half of the first decade of the 21st century. And then I came to Wales in 2010, and I came to my shame, to a country about which I knew little. I didn't realise that 1 in 3 people in Wales were reasonably fluent in the Welsh language, most of them as their first language. I had never before been exposed to the tradition of song, music, a fantastic, powerful, emotional, very often, tradition of creativity that, because it was often in the Welsh language, was never heard anywhere else in the UK for the most part. A place which was built on much stronger communitarian, cooperative traditions than in England certainly had largely survived. A place where the public values are significantly different and the culture is significantly different from those in England. And I knew virtually none of this, even though I'd been working just 100 miles away in London for 25 years. And why was that? And part of the reason for that is that we are so London-dominated, we're so England-dominated in the UK, that let alone migrants and refugees, even long-standing cultures and languages that date back, in Wales's case, the language, certainly the Celtic cultures appeared about 3,000 years ago there. Those are almost invisible. I think I've hardly ever, in all my many years, heard the Welsh language on network BBC radio or television, despite the fact that 1/3 of the population speak it fluently. We live in the UK in a very centric, a very elite-dominated society in which, in my view, cultural democracy is paper thin. And I had to confront this realization of my own ignorance of this when I moved to Wales. So please, never let the United Kingdom lecture anybody else on cultural inclusion, including me. So, immediately, there was the challenge of developing the St Fagans Museum with, and we should be very grateful for this, Heritage Lottery Fund funding, as well as money from the Welsh Government and other sources. And I was lucky that there are a team of staff there, predominantly Welsh-speaking, at St Fagans, who are passionate about changing the way that the museum would work. And they wanted Wales, the National Museum, to critique its own history. We didn't want yet another history museum which celebrated how great Wales is. We have to be more mature and grown up than that, which is not to say there are not many positives in Wales's past, but we needed also to look at those things which are debated, conflictual, embarrassing from a contemporary point of view as well. They wanted to be able to say, for example, that during the horrendous 1984 miners' strike, the conflict between many of the industrial workers and Margaret Thatcher, not every Welsh miner was opposed to Margaret Thatcher. Not everybody was on the side of the striking miners. It's a comfortable myth to say and act as if that was the case, but that's not true. And that has to be debated in public as well, for example. And this group of staff wanted to create a museum where co-production and cooperation were absolutely at the core of the work of the museum, which explored really and is based upon what it means to be human. And therefore not just, as most galleries do, to think through the head, but also to think through the heart and to think through the hand. as we saw with one of the examples at the presentation before lunch. And so this is to be a museum of critical thinking, and we'll have to see how well we achieve that goal. But in a sense, everything that now follows that I want to say comes from my own cultural shock, if you like, in a way, in going into a different cultural context in the United Kingdom, 100 miles from London. And the first thing I would say then is that in the time I've been there, the public funding budgets from Westminster, but therefore also have to be applied by the Welsh Government, have been cut by approximately 30% in real terms. So we've been working in a context of our legs being cut away from us financially, and I think it's true by the sound of it in many other countries, including some of those in Latin America. Therefore, one thought that's in my head is we have to fight really hard for public, whether it's public service, whether it's the whole concept of public space as well, with all respect to Malraux and the very, very strong idea that museums must exist outside their walls. If we lose the museums inside the walls, we also lose something valuable for those who need social space, safe space, inclusive space as well. Because the neoliberals will sweep away public space in every way. The neoliberalism, in my view, does not respect public. It's an ideology which is based on it being both everywhere and nowhere, and with the power to appear or disappear as it wishes. It's an ideology which has no particular interest in individuals or communities. It's an ideology which has no commitment to the past or really to the future beyond its own local interest. In other words, it's the antithesis of the public. And we have to confront that ideological reality, in my view. And we also then have to fight for the public as being that thing which is shared between us. And Hossein referred today about the concept of common sense. And I would want to add to what he said, the Scottish tradition of common sense, which was rooted in the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, and which held that the expertise of the professional should be accountable to and disciplined by the expertise of the public. The public has expertise, and that must be respected. And that version of common sense, I believe, is a very, very powerful discipline upon us in museums and in other areas in the ways in which we work. And some of that, not particularly through my agency, but through my colleagues who have their strong wish to introduce co-production and cooperation, is part of what St. Fagans, I hope, will represent. And I also want to mention the public funding element as well. There's a writer, Mariana, an economist, in fact, Mazzucato, who has published a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And what she wants to argue is how much of innovation has come through public funding. And very often a different kind of innovation that will be produced by the private sector. Now, I don't deny the innovation that the private sector brings. I mean, those of us who have iPhones and Apple computers could scarcely be in a position to do so. But we have to remember there are other kinds of innovation which are only possible on the principles of the public. And those are the things I believe at the moment which we're in danger of losing. Also to be confronted for me was the issue of poverty and inclusion. And there was reference this morning to the fact that Wales has some of the highest levels of poverty anywhere in Europe, which is really quite saying something, and the highest levels of child poverty in the United Kingdom. And it's getting worse, and it's getting worse quickly. Now, as a national museum, can we stand by and say, we're about culture with a capital C, we're not about poverty with a capital P, it's not our job? I don't believe that's intellectually, philosophically, a viable position to be in. But then, if you take as part of our responsibility, as part of our core work, that we should be trying to maybe not have the power to change poverty, but to change the impacts of poverty through our work, then that means we have to reorder our work very, very significantly and very, very seriously, because it's not easy. I can say this after 4 or 5 years of us developing this work in Wales. This is not easy work. And in particular, to try to do it at a national scale, which the Welsh Government is now trying to do, despite all the antagonism of the UK government, it's trying to make child poverty one of its key policy development areas, and we as a museum are doing the same, not because the Welsh Government tells us to, but because we believe it's morally and ethically what a museum should be doing. That is a difficult task, a really challenging one, and one for which we've created a new research post, which will look specifically at the work we're doing around poverty and inclusion and cultural participation. And that post holder has just gone into post 2 months ago, and we have her at least for 2 years. And I personally am very committed that whatever other funding we get or don't get, we will continue that research. So poverty and inclusion is crucial in this as well. And the voices of non-dominant groups is critical. Those who don't participate, why they don't participate. I still don't think our research is strong enough in this area to enable us to know in practice how we can change that. There are, in the English language anyway, there are virtually none that I'm aware of, longitudinal studies which tell us over time the impact of cultural participation and cultural intervention. And in particular, the kind of participations that have an impact over time, over generations, on, if you like, the empowerment through culture of people to meet their own needs. There's a huge amount of work to be done on this. I don't stand in front of you saying I know all the answers. All I'm doing is standing in front of you and saying we are committed to the journey. And those groups who are the marginalized and the outsiders bring their own expertise, have their own common sense, and actually enrich us all in our understanding of ourselves and the cultures of which we're comfortable too. And I do not believe that a museum that respects itself and respects its society cannot draw on those talents, those elements of creativity which the marginalized, the excluded have. So I would argue that we have to confront 2 elephants, presently almost outside the room, maybe in the room. The first one is that we should not be political. Now, I fully acknowledge the principle that we should not support one political party. In Wales, it happens to be the dominant party in government, the Labour Party, or the Conservatives, who are dominant in the United Kingdom, or any other political party. I believe we lose our mandate if we do that. But I think that doesn't mean that we cannot discuss the role of political ideologies and their impacts on our work. That, I think, is a different thing. That is why I have deliberately raised the issue of our relationship to neoliberalism. That neoliberalism is about denial of those very things which I believe should be core to museums, of place, of culture, of individuals, of communities, where we are, not where the neoliberals choose to put things. I'm putting that on the table, I'm putting that on the ground, and saying we have to discuss this. Neoliberalism and its wicked child austerity are damaging many museums across the world now. We heard Antonio speaking about the risk to his museum. I mean, I could say that in Wales, large numbers of local museums are now at risk of closing precisely because public funding is diminishing so rapidly that the local authorities can no longer afford to support them. Museums are anchor institutions. They are the antithesis of the neoliberal everywhere and nowhere ideology. of the movability of everything across the globe. Museums are anchors for many communities, and they can be vital. And if we lose them, we will lose something that's maybe in some countries like the UK, taken 150 years perhaps to build up. And once they're gone, how easy will it be for us ever to restore them? We need a literature of politics and museums. One of the very few I know is Yuri Dombrowski's 1930s novel, The Keeper of Antiquities, in English anyway, that was the title, about fictionalized work based on his own experience of being a curator in Stalinist Russia as the wave of Stalinism hit out to Kazakhstan, to where he'd been exiled. Now, it's a dark humor, this, but underneath it, a very, very serious story that another writer said, this novel was written with our heart's blood. Now, we need a literature of politics and museums, but actually we also need the debate, and I just really don't see where the debate is at the moment in any mature way. Now, the second elephant in the room, in my view, is that the Anglo-European, North American model of museums has had its day. It may be the dominant one still, but it is no longer fit for purpose. In the 19th century, when many of UK's major museums were created, they were created on a set of principles which actually included a great deal more educational purpose than in the 20th century was allowed to continue. But certainly the way that model has started as an innovative model, but in my view very often has become a deeply conservative, deeply socially conservative model, is damaging the sector. And it's very hard to change when it's almost built into the stones of many of the institutions themselves. And the ideology is almost built into the stones as well. We need new methodologies. We need a new philosophy of museums. We need a radical museum thesis, movement, argument, belief. And if we rely upon the one which is represented by the British Museum, by the Tate, by bits of my own institution as well, although we're changing, I hope, if we rely upon that static glass case model, we will be doomed in the end. We will not have the support when we need it, from the places we need it to. And I have to say, one of the reasons I came to this conference was not to speak at it, well, I'm grateful for the chance to do so, but actually to listen and to see new models emerging, as I think I heard a bit on the, well, a lot actually, on the platform this morning from the other speakers. And I think it's a generational thing as well. My generation will pass from this sector soon enough. And one of the things that's great about this conference is just how many young professionals there are. And I have to say, here are the problems. Now you're going to need to do better than we have done. You need to do this work. I mean, we should do some of it, but actually, at the end of the day, you need to do this work. And museums will only continue to have meaning in the 21st century if you challenge what those of us who are older have been doing. Challenge the big institutions. That hierarchy should not exist. There was a question this morning about community museums. Every museum should be a community museum, foundation, before they're anything else. If they're not that, no matter how mighty they are, no matter how strong their walls, no matter how beautiful their collections management is, if they're not community museums, they are not museums, in my view, not in the true sense of the word. So we must not look to these gods of museums for our answers, because they have not got them, for the most part. They have in places, they have individuals within them who are working for something different, but actually as institutions, they are the old, they're not the new. And the new are the kind of things we heard from the other speakers on the platform this morning. Different ways of working, more humane ways of working, people-centered ways of working. So that, for me, is our second great elephant, that we ourselves are part of the problem, and we have to change that. So, to conclude, my challenge for you and myself, what is the new radical museology? What are its characteristics? I would argue they should be people-centered and community-centered, based on the implementation of human rights through action, about learning to think, to feel, to create, to develop oneself, about cultural democracy, about participation through one's own language, but actually even more important, through one's own culture as well. About founded on social justice, about enabling people to shape the culture of which they are part, and not just to experience it, and to have a public space to do all this in. And I think this conference is a crucially important opportunity for new voices to be heard and new methodologies to be discussed, and for this process of change to get more momentum. Thank you. Yeah, of course you are. Okay, yeah. I'm told there is time for questions, so does anybody want to ask one? Or to criticize me, or to attack me? I want this. If I say I want dialogue and critical thinking, I can hardly not wish it to be for my ideas as well. And I do blame Americo up there, by the way, in part for this. Like many people, we think Americo is to blame for all this, really.
Hello, I have a question over here. Hi.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see very easily.
When you were speaking about having a critical thinking museum that can, push aside myths and speak about its own history in a critical way, what has happened when you changed your museum? What has happened with the reactions of the people there and, of course, of the different stakeholders? Because it's the community and it's also the interests and the funding, and I think it's something that we all need, have a critical museum. But what has happened, and also what happened with the same workers of the museum?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Now, really, I would have to talk in generalities rather than particulars. You'd understand, really, there. One of the first things I asked in my first week on arriving there at the St. Fagans project team meeting was, who is this project for? One of my colleagues replied, for the curators of the British Museum. And he wasn't joking. And embedded in that is the idea, which I can understand at one level, that the curators of the British Museum are the most expert in certain fields in the UK, and therefore what we do must be recognized by them as being of quality. So that was, if you like, it was a respectable but narrow view really there. But it also said, by what was not said was more important in some ways really, because who was not mentioned as being who it was for. So we have been through very painful change, and I'll be honest about that. And we've, in fact, got strikes at the moment in the museum about changes to terms and conditions of staff. And we've also been through one major restructuring where we redefined staff's roles. And all the professional staff, pretty well, had to reapply for their jobs with new job descriptions, with new expectations of their work. And I would say that's only the beginning of the process in that way. That's kind of top-down, because our budgets were being cut so rapidly, we had to take action, and those were some of the consequent actions really there. But more significant, I think, than what the senior management team has done is maybe what we have allowed to happen, if you like, which is that those very creative staff, and I will name some of them here because they deserve to be named, Beth Thomas, who's the keeper of social history and archaeology, Nia Williams, who's the head of learning, they have carried in their hearts and their heads and their hands an idea of a different kind of St. Fagans. And they have done that through practice, and they have invited other staff to participate in that. They have gone off to talk with the homeless charity, the drug aid charities, and the others. So they have brought the cultural change arguably more powerfully than we as senior managers have done. And more staff in the museum are beginning to use the St. Fagans methodology. There are 7 museums of the National Museum Wales. St. Fagans is just one of them. But increasingly, other staff are using pop-up museums and going into communities. They are engaging in a different kind of dialogue about their collections. The natural sciences curators did a murder mystery where you needed to rely upon using evidence from the natural sciences collections as if you were a detective to solve the problem. Very creative way of trying to introduce things that otherwise would be very inaccessible, and in a way that people could understand. So I would say arguably it's about encouraging and enabling people to be creative in that way has been most important. But it is hard, I won't deny that. Far more of my time is spent with struggling with the resource and other challenges than is on the interesting and creative other bits, you know. Okay, if there's no more questions, thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Oh, which one is there? I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. Yes, go on.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, I come from Peru where there are a lot of issues regarding collections, basically, okay? Historical, archaeological collections. So my question goes through this, to this issue. Working with community and really turning the museum into a community museum and changing the lives of people, which are the impacts that you have seen regarding collection keeping and collection renewal? Does it imply a lot of movement regarding collections?
Okay. I didn't have time to say before, but St. Fagan's Museum, a social history museum, its collections have largely been donated, whether it's buildings or objects, by individuals across Wales. And the museum, over the 60 years and more that it's existed, has tried to maintain connection with those communities that were the source and donor communities. I would ask maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, if you possibly can, come to Wales, come to St. Fagan's, and talk with the staff who are doing this work, because some of that community relation work was already going on, but it was isolated rather than core, if you like. So the result for us of the changes is to re-energize that process of communities being involved in those kind of decisions, to the point where job descriptions now are being scrutinized and by people from some of the charities and some of the community organizations, and the selection process now including their voice of selection of staff, now including the voice of those groups in the process too, including sometimes being on selection panels. So we are rethinking our collections policy root and branch at the moment, and it'll be another year or two before we've done that. But the intention is to be based much more, going back to America, what's the need? The whole rethinking of the vision of the organization has been what does Wales need? What would make a difference to Wales? And collecting will be part of that as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.